Real Talk the podcast. We just keeping it real. Inspirational motivation is something that you can feel. Authentic, I know you can tell. Hosted by Kimberly Sherrill. We got food for thought. Come help yourself. One of a kind like nobody else. Yeah, wanna see you mentally grow in a major way. Play this back like day to day. See all that stress and doubt, just watch it fade away. There is nothing you cannot achieve. Good vibes, yeah, we got that. Kimberly, go ahead and talk to him. It's the Real Talk podcast. Let's go.
Well, hello there, beautiful people. You are listening to Real Talk the podcast. I am your host, Kimberly Sherrill. I'm so excited that you decided to join me, whatever day that this is that you are listening to this episode. Just know that I am eternally grateful for the amount of time that you have shared with me. So, that's always just humbled by your presence. So I'm so excited. I have with me today in the guest chair, Tamera Foley. Hi, Tamera.
Hi, Kimberly. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm just well.
So tell the beautiful listeners a little bit about you.
Well, thank you so much, Kimberly, for having me. I am a retired educator, a veteran educator of over 34 years in urban education. I am now an educational consultant, and I work with school districts. I can work with agencies, and I do professional development. I'm also a trauma educator practitioner. I also work with schools on dropout education and social-emotional learning. I also have a weekly live on Facebook in support for children in trauma. And we have discussions and just educate and increase the knowledge of our group about trauma and the children that we serve.
Okay, well that's great because over the last few years, you really now see more of an acknowledgement that children experience trauma, have pushed away from, oh, that child is just bad. Oh, she's just acting out, and really being more informed about the fact that childhood trauma exists and that it is expressed through children in many different ways.
Absolutely. And one of the things is that sometimes people used to think childhood trauma wasn't real, but it is very real because I've been able to connect with even some adults who, through their own childhood trauma, is still having some issues, still experiencing that healing process, and really still having some delayed effects. So certainly during this pandemic, we are seeing more and more children and adults experiencing trauma.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm also happy to see this myth being bust that you can 100% get over childhood trauma. And it's the thing about it is that trauma is a part of your journey. Once the trauma happens, it's a part of your journey, and it will always be a part of your journey. But through lots of working on healing, you are able to work through the trauma and work around the trauma. But just telling people, as an adult that how something that happened to them that was traumatic when they were 10, oh, that shouldn't still be a factor. That is not necessarily the case, but if the person has been working on healing, they can then work through and work around that trauma.
Absolutely. And I think we have to look at trauma is not an event. It's an experience. You may have been involved in an event, but it's certainly the experience that continues to be something that you have to work on. Also, you can experience trauma not even from directly, but indirectly, even from seeing other people in traumatic situations. And people don't really ever think about that. Just think about a child who may never have been shot at, but certainly they saw someone else that has been shot. So they experience trauma not directly, but indirectly. And so I think a lot of information just needs to be shared and people just need to be open to hear. And I'm glad to hear you say that it's not something that it's a one and done, because certainly it is not. And there are many ways that people can work through the healing process.
Completely, and I have always been very transparent about the fact that I have experienced a lot of trauma in my childhood, and I am always actively working on moving past those experiences so that they are not having traumatic effects on my day to day. And more importantly to me, I don't want to pass my trauma along to my children. And that's something I know you can relate to this 100% in the education field. You see it a lot. The parents experience trauma, and because they never heal, they then impose trauma on their child, and it becomes a vicious cycle that needs to really end.
Absolutely, because they're feeling their trauma all over and they're just re traumatizing themselves. So, certainly, that is glad to hear that that's something that you are very well aware of and working on, because it does happen. And it's that transference of that emotion that we don't want to do.
Absolutely. And you said something just a little while ago, and you said that it doesn't necessarily have to be something that happens to you. It can be something that you witness that has an effect. When I was in the fourth grade, one of my classmates' fingers were shut in a door, and this was an old school building. So it pretty much snapped off three of his fingers, like they were hanging on by the skin. To this day, I remember that moment of the door slamming, of him screaming, and just him running and sliding down the hall with that bloody hand. Like, to this day, I remember it so vividly. And I worked with a teacher who had a habit of slamming a door when he was mad. That was his way of letting out his frustration. He always wanted to slam a door. And literally every time he would slam a classroom door that was a heavy door like what I saw when I was a kid, I relived that moment. And I finally had to have that conversation with him. I'm like, you're going to have to pay for my therapy, because every time you slam a door, I'm going back to this moment, because that is why I don't slam doors. That's one of the reasons why I don't even really like closing a door, especially with children around, because I'm afraid of that. And after we had that conversation, he became more mindful of the door slamming. He told me that now every time he slams a door, he thinks about me. And when we were still next door to each other, when he would slam the door and he'd catch himself after class, he'd come and was like, I'm sorry, I got caught up in it. He'd bring me a Coke or something. He's like, I'm sorry, your nerve's really bad. It kind of became a thing. But me having that experience was traumatic for me. And then me telling him about it, it made him aware of how some of the things that he could be doing are affecting other people around him, because that's one of the things that everybody has to be mindful of, especially when working with children, is that the trauma takes people to different places, and to be able to really be effective, we kind of have to have a certain amount of mindfulness of others around us.
Absolutely. And it was great that you brought it to his attention. Another thing that we have to be concerned about is our own mental health. So, just as you were having that experience, you were also intensely working on the mental health part of your brain. And we want to ensure that that you aren't then suffering from stress or anxiety or other things that because you're reliving that trauma. So I'm so happy to hear that he at least had an ear to hear and at least made some changes so that you didn't have to re-experience your trauma.
Absolutely. Oh, I was a lot happier in my day to day. Once the door slamming went from like 20 times a day to about 5. That was a lot better. So, what sparked your interest in working, doing this work as it relates to childhood trauma?
Well, most of my experience as an educator has been in the area of special education, student services. So I've been working with children that always had some type of trauma. And at the time, we probably just didn't call it trauma, but it was trauma. And so some of their experiences. So just through the years, and I just became more and more interested because I was seeing more and more families dealing with trauma and having to really help them through that prior to us being able to help their child academically. And so I think that's part of why my interest is there. And I know how important the emotional piece is, and as it relates to children academically.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, what would you say to educators who are listening to this and they are unaware of having any students who have experienced any type of trauma? What would you say is one of the red flags or indicators that they can look for in their classroom that you may say, this child may have experienced trauma?
Well, I think if you see any changes in that child, any changes in the child's behavior, if the child seems to be disconnected or isolated, if the child doesn't ever share any experiences about their home life, if the child misses a lot of school, if the child doesn't ever want you to speak to their parent or just doesn't talk about their family, if the child has difficulty uh, with friendships. If the child sometimes just seems lethargic, if the child just doesn't want to speak, or sometimes just is disconnected from the class or what you're doing, or doesn't seem to have fun with any activities. So there are many red flags, but those would be the ones that I would say probably are most prominent in the classroom.
And it's interesting, some of the things that you highlighted would be what most people would consider to just be a quiet student. You know, just a student who likes to keep to themselves, who is quiet. And you may have, that occasional very quiet, student, but a child who is very socially disconnected because little children are social beings. They want to socialize and interact with each other. And so that's definitely, that's a population I think that gets overlooked more than people realize is that very quiet child.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we as educators have to do, and now we are seeing more and more a focus on trauma informed schools, trauma informed practices, but also you mentioned mindfulness. We're seeing mindfulness techniques being instituted in schools, but also we have to understand that children really need to have conversations. And so teachers could be utilizing social and emotional techniques and practices. And that's just starting out every day with a greeting. How are you today? How are you feeling today? Children writing in their journals, taking a moment to journal, taking a moment to say, if I'm going to designate this 10 minutes, and I know everybody's busy, but I'm going to designate this 10 minutes. If anybody has anything they need to come and speak to me privately about, I'm available. So letting your children know, being able to build in those components of social and emotional learning in the classroom is important. And again, it is more important than that academics, because you can't get to the academics if the children emotionally are not ready.
I would agree with that. And I would say, from an educator standpoint myself, it's not even so much that teachers do not want to connect with their students in that fashion. But we are seeing now there is such an overkill of academics and the pressure of a teacher, having certain test scores and things like that, feeling that pressure to get through an overloaded curriculum, in the time of year. And so when you are at these schools and working with these different districts, are these conversations that you're having with the powers that be, as they say, as far as how important it is for teachers to have the space and the time to connect with these students and to do this social emotional learning?
Absolutely. And certainly, when we're invited in by the principal or the superintendent. So we've already had some conversation about some of the things that we may be discussing and the importance. And I've seen more school districts implement social and emotional learning, but I've also seen some school districts who need help with social and emotional learning reach out, but then really don't follow through. So it's up to people like me to follow up with them to say how important this is. And this is why you may see your rate of suicide going up. This is why you may see more and more children needing mental health support. Because what we know is from of the 11 to 17-year-old children who took a mental health screening since March of 2020, we know that 83% of those children that took a screening are at risk of anxiety. So we already know this. And we know that a lot of this happened prior to the pandemic. Now we know that the numbers have really gone up since then. So we really have to be more aware, and we have to really implement those practices. And I think once you have the superintendent, your school board, and all of these people who are decision makers noticing, if they just look at the news every day, someone's talking about trauma, the trauma they've been through, the trauma they're experiencing, whether it's an adult or a child, that this is a must in our schools today.
And the pandemic has really highlighted that, I would say. And I wish I could remember the number, but I don't remember the percent. But they were talking about the amount of child abuse, child neglect cases, how they have drastically went up since the pandemic. And I think that is because school for many children was their safe haven. That was their escape from, the reality of whatever was happening at home. And now they are home so much that there's no longer an escape. And it's really difficult to connect as a teacher with students via Zoom, especially those who won't turn their cameras on. And your teachers will see that there's students who are embarrassed by what their home looks like, what's happening in their home, and they're not turning their cameras on. And so it's that much harder to really connect with those students and to give them that support that school has always been for them.
Right, it is. And sometimes also when the parent is sitting right there, and the parent is the person who is the aggressor, or what I call the aggressor, who is the person that is part of the trauma. So it's really hard for that child to be able to speak. But one of the ways that we see that educators have been able to overcome some of this is when they have a one-on-one, again, if the parent's not sitting there, if it's possible to have a one-on-one with that child in a separate room on the virtual platform. But it is difficult, and it is difficult for them to even reach out. So what we'll know is that even though we don't know how many children who are still virtually learning or online learning are experiencing some type of abuse. What we know is when everybody one day returns back to the buildings, that we're going to see a drastic increase of reporting. And I want to share too that one of the school districts in Nevada had to actually bring their children back to school because of all of the suicides that they were experiencing in their district. So if people don't think or don't realize the social, emotional, and mental health of children and adults that's going on right now, it is real. And we're seeing it, and school districts are having to make difficult decisions to accommodate the children that they serve.
That's true. And it has been mentioned about parents being the aggressor. You have a lot too where it's an older sibling or an older relative. It will be, and we're seeing that a lot where the parents have to go back to work. And so there is this high school age sibling or of the adult age, 18, 19, 20, and this person is being left home with the children. And this person is the aggressor. This person is the predator. And getting those children away from that particular person to where they're not hovering over them or in an earshot, is difficult as well. And, it has to be mentally exhausting for a child who was used to playing the cat and mouse game during the school day. Get away from them on the school bus, and you got the school day, you're free. Now you just got to play cat and mouse at home. And now you're just home all day with very little adult supervision or responsible adult supervision.
And it's happening every day. So I'm really hoping that as this year progresses, that in the fall, we can see more children being able to go back in the classroom at school so that they can feel safe and that they have that safe haven, somebody to talk to, and just really for them to feel safe and calm. Because when you're feeling stressed or you have anxiety, you also have those physical effects on your body. And so we really need for children to be able to experience the calm, to experience some sense of structure, and just some sense of safety.
Absolutely. So we've talked about social and emotional learning as it relates to school and simple things to do, but social and emotional learning should also happen at home. What are some things that parents, especially parents who are not in the home with their children all day, they're gone out and you're coming back in and you're exhausted, but you still need to be socially interacting with your children. What are some things that parents can do as far as SEL at home?
One of the important things parents can do is really just checking in with their children. How are you doing today? How are you feeling? Really looking at their behaviors, taking time to, can you join me, whether they're making dinner, or can you join me and let's just have a conversation right now? Or let's have a conversation while we're cooking. And if some of the children aren't very expressive, then, oh, what can you draw for me? Can you draw for me how you're feeling right now? Um, Listening to what type of conversations they're having with their peers, listening to the conversations they may be having with their siblings, and those relationships, and having their children also be self-aware of how they're feeling. How are you feeling? And mom and dad maybe sharing some of how they're feeling, and letting children know that every day is not a perfect day. And even I, as an adult, am not perfect. And so I may be having some feelings of loneliness, or I may be having some feelings of isolation. But here's some things that I do to help me. So maybe you could try those things. So I think the conversation is so important. But again, if a child is not into conversation, then having them draw, using other tools. Play-Doh is a great tool to use to have children just mold and just work out some of those emotions. So having it be a family
All
affair.
right. So, yes, definitely all of those things do sound wonderful. There's been, it's been trending on social media a little bit and not so much at other times, but adults talking about how they wish their parents had apologized to them when they did not get things, right. And there is this old school thought process that as an adult, you are right and you don't owe a child an apology when you miss the mark. But to me, that's adding trauma by not acknowledging that, you know what, I came in and I was yelling and it was not about you. I was frustrated from my day and I took it out on you. You know what? I accused you of not having, done this, but you really had. And, the cat, the dog, whoever came back in and made the mess and it was not you. What is your opinion on apologizing to your children when you are missing the mark?
I, as a parent, have apologized. I have an adult child now, of course, but I have apologized to my child because we all have those days, and we have to let our children know that we're not perfect. And if we don't let them know, and if we don't let them know how we're feeling, then how are we modeling for them? How are we helping them? We're not. And we have to get away. Some of the things that our parents did, they did it because that they felt that was the best at that time. But now I think we have to think differently. Our world is different. And certainly, there's nothing wrong with apologizing to your child. There's nothing wrong with letting your child uh, know and see that you have emotions, and you're teaching them the techniques of how to deal with them. If they never see you deal with your issues, how are they going to know what to do when they have those feelings? And so then it just becomes what I call a generational curse. And it just keeps going and going and going. And so certainly we need to stop and put a stop on it right now. And parents, we need to just accept that there are times when we don't make the mark. And it's okay to say, I'm sorry, and I'm going to work on that.
I completely agree. We all know an adult, well, most of us, I can't say everyone. I'm assuming most of us know an adult who never admits when he or she is wrong. And that is learned behavior. That's learned behavior. That's not genetics. That's learned behavior. And that's how it is learned when you can't acknowledge that you made a mistake, because we all do it.
Absolutely. And none of us are perfect. We don't live in a perfect world. So we as adults, we have to step up. And I think that's how we continue to build relationships with our children and relationships with others. So how can we build a relationship with our child? Because we put our child in a situation where they may become anxious, they may become fearful, because regardless, or thinking that you're lowering their self-esteem because they're thinking that everything they do is causing you some type of issue. And certainly we know that that's not always the case.
100%. I completely agree. So, before we wrap up, tell everyone that is listening that would like to learn more about you and your services. Tell them how to connect with you. If you have a website, how to find you on social media so that they can start tuning in to those Facebook Lives.
Thank you. So the website is education, the number 4, allnow.org. You can connect with me on Facebook at Education for All Now, LLC. My Facebook group is Support for Children in Trauma. You can connect with me on Instagram at Education for All Now. And those are the ways that we can connect. And those are the ways, if you want to learn more about trauma, social emotional learning, or just have a consultation, I am available. But certainly, we would love for you to join our Facebook group, because that group is intended for us to support one another. And there are parents in the group, there are foster parents, grandparents, doctors, teachers, just a variety of people that are here to support children in trauma. And many of them have been in those situations or are currently have children who are experiencing trauma. So it's a supportive group. And so we certainly invite you to become.
All right, that is wonderful. So you guys have all the information. Go ahead and connect. If you are an educator and you know that your school has not implemented some type of social and emotional learning and you know your students need it, I'm definitely encouraging you to go ahead and connect, get your principal involved so that you can get this training, because it's very necessary. You have to deal with children from a holistic perspective and deal with their needs. And that goes just beyond, food and shelter. Children need to be emotionally healthy so that they are able to be open and connect and learn all of the things that you are teaching them. All right. Well, this has been a wonderful episode of Real Talk, the podcast. Tamera, I want to say thank you so much for being on here. To all of the beautiful listeners, thank you so much. You guys just make my week every single week by tuning in and listening, because you could have been anywhere else, but you decided to spend this time with me.